What makes a great RPG? Is it deep character customization, intricate progression systems, a reactive world, or is it simply the ability to make meaningful choices that shape your journey? I've been thinking a lot recently about how the Elder Scrolls series has evolved in this regard. With each new entry, Bethesda has made changes to how we create and develop our characters, how we interact with the world, and how much freedom we have in shaping our stories. But as these mechanics have evolved, have they truly improved from a role-playing perspective, or have they been simplified in the pursuit of mass market appeal? The evolution of RPG mechanics in the Elder Scrolls series has been gradual, but there was a marked shift between Oblivion and Skyrim that I want to analyse in greater detail. Rather than simply comparing them as games, I want to compare them as RPGs specifically. There's no denying that Skyrim is by far the more successful game, selling 60 million copies compared to Oblivion's estimated 9.5 million. You could reasonably argue that just based on that data alone, that this makes Skyrim the better game, as it completely crushes Oblivion in any meaningful measure of success, at least in that regard. However, it doesn't automatically make it the better RPG, at least not in my opinion, so grab a hot drink and let's talk about that. During Oblivion's tutorial in the Imperial Sewers, the game effectively asks you, who are you going to be? You're hit with classic RPG decisions from the very beginning. Firstly, you select your race, which in Oblivion does have a meaningful impact on gameplay. Then you choose a birth sign, such as the warrior or the mage, that grants a permanent bonus or power. And then you either pick or create a class that determines your major skills, which in turn will drastically impact the way in which you level up your character. Each of these skills is governed by one of your character's 8 attributes: strength, intelligence, willpower, agility, speed, endurance, personality, and luck. And the way in which all of these relatively complex systems come together is something of a throwback to pen and paper D&D stats. They provide a system rich in meaningful character decisions, but also one that you could quite easily mess up if you don't plan for it correctly. In Skyrim, by contrast, the approach to character creation is almost shockingly simple. You choose your race, you customize your appearance, and out into the world you go. There are no classes or birth signs locking you in. You're a blank slate, free to take your character in any direction that you please. Skyrim axed the classic D&D style attributes of Oblivion almost entirely, and instead they were replaced with 3 primary stats: health, magicka, and stamina, which I'd consider to be more resources than attributes in the classic sense, but that's probably just me being overly pedantic. Now, of course, some longtime fans felt that this was streamlining taken a step too far, and that it removed a meaningful layer of RPG depth. After all, in Oblivion, you did have to give far more consideration to that role-playing aspect from the very beginning of the game. Was your hero going to be brainy, brawny, or charismatic, or even a mixture of these things? Whereas in Skyrim, these nuances are gone. There is, of course, an enormous upside to the changes implemented in Skyrim, and that comes in the form of accessibility. Skyrim's system is immediately understandable in a way that Oblivion's simply isn't, and if you think Oblivion's system is simple, then honestly, you probably don't understand it yourself. The way that major and minor skills play into leveling and the attribute bonuses that you receive upon gaining a level is neither intuitive or well explained by the game itself. The average player is far less likely to ruin a character build by assigning points incorrectly in Skyrim. Yes, there are pitfalls that should ideally be avoided, but by and large you can just play the game, your character will develop naturally, and most mistakes can eventually be undone. The downside of this, of course, is the loss of that fine-tuned character identity. In my view, the Oblivion character creation and development system simply gave a flavour to your character that Skyrim's system ultimately sacrificed in favour of accessibility and mass appeal. Let's look at skills a little more closely, as they're the bread and butter of Elder Scrolls progression. Oblivion features 21 skills, each of which is governed by one of your character's 8 attributes. As already mentioned, the class you pick will determine which 7 skills are considered your major skills, with the remaining 14 being considered minor skills. Unlike in Skyrim, where the use of any skill will contribute towards your character leveling up, in Oblivion only your major skills do this. Basically, you gain a character level each time you level your major skills by 10 points combined. As in, all 10 points don't have to be in a single major skill, they can be spread across multiple major skills. Now, this might lead you to the natural conclusion that your minor skills aren't overly important. However, when your character levels up, you receive attribute bonuses, and those attribute bonuses are dictated by the use of both the major and minor skills that those attributes govern. As you can see, this is getting fairly complex, and this convoluted skill system led to the notorious efficient leveling meta, where players deliberately hold off on leveling major skills in order to level their minor skills and therefore get the best possible attribute bonuses when their character levels up. It's kind of a min-maxer's dream, and stick with me on this one for a moment, a role player's nightmare. The reason I say this is because this system requires you to play in a very unnatural way if you wish to be optimal. And because of the very poorly implemented enemy scaling system in Oblivion, you do have to be quite optimal if you want to play at higher difficulty settings. Therefore, you're forced into a way of playing the game that might not suit the way in which you wanted to develop your character, which is pretty immersion breaking from a role-playing perspective. In Skyrim, Bethesda threw that entire system out of the window, with every skill increase contributing experience towards your next character level. It doesn't matter if it's a combat skill or a crafting skill, it all counts. You also don't have to consider how the skills that you've used during the previous levels will influence your attributes. When you level up in Skyrim, you only have to decide whether to increase health, stamina, or magicka by 10 points. This is a far simpler system all round. The major innovation Skyrim did introduce, however, and where a small element of complexity is added back in, is the perk system. Each of the game's 18 skills has a perk tree, and every time you level you earn 1 perk point to invest. The beauty of this is that it makes Skyrim's system both simpler to comprehend and actually more customizable, just in a different way. You're not crunching attribute numbers anymore, but you are planning which perks define your character's abilities. And I think it's a fair argument that perks, for the most part, are more interesting than basic attribute increases. This system also offers a lot more freedom, due to the fact that perk points are agnostic to which perk tree you spend them in. You could, for example, level up using your sneak skill, and then invest the perk that you earned from that level in smithing, let's say. But then coming back to the focus of the debate, is that necessarily a good thing in terms of role-playing? Is it a good thing that your role is so fluid in Skyrim, or is the ability to suddenly gain a perk and a skill that you haven't even touched yet actually counterintuitive to what role-playing should look like? Which traditionally would be gaining the knowledge of a blacksmith by, actually smithing. In other words, Skyrim lets you dabble everywhere, whereas Oblivion encourages you to stick to your archetype by tying your advancement to your chosen major skills. And this difference fundamentally affects role-playing. Oblivion nudges you to commit to a character concept, whereas Skyrim effectively says, do whatever you want, whenever you want to do it. Neither approach is inherently wrong, and it's really just a question of preference, but I do believe that Oblivion's system is truer to the classic RPG. In fact, I'd like to put that question to you. Do you enjoy planning a character build from the start and living within those constraints, or do you prefer the game to adapt to how you end up playing? Skyrim clearly bet on the latter, and therefore it made the game approachable to millions of people who might have been intimidated by Oblivion's stat juggling approach. Though during the transition between these two systems, I think that some RPG depth was undeniably lost. Basically that classic role-playing process in which you plan and commit to a role. Speaking of roles, I'm kind of hoping to expand my role into creating much more of this RPG video essay style content. I'll be offering plenty of this on YouTube for free, as I always have done, but I'm also going to be releasing tons of RPG discussion and analysis videos over on Patreon as well. And I'll put the link in the description for those of you who might be interested. I'll also make those videos available to YouTube members if Patreon isn't your thing. Anyway, while we're on the topic of skills, it's also worth talking about the removal and merging of skills over the course of the Elder Scrolls series. One obvious change is just the sheer number of skills. Morrowind had 27 skills, Oblivion then trimmed this to 21, and Skyrim made a further reduction to 18. In Skyrim, skills like acrobatics and athletics, which in Oblivion let you run faster and jump higher, are completely gone. Your movement speed and jump height are basically fixed, aside from some temporary effects. Some players miss that sense of physical improvement, whereas others don't really miss how in Oblivion a high-level character could basically leap across the landscape like a kangaroo. I don't know why, because it was awesome. Though, to be fair, not having to make design decisions that incorporate the potential for a character to make 10-foot jumps probably does make sense from a developer's perspective. Skyrim also merged or removed a number of other skills as well. Mercantile and Speechcraft were combined into a single skill called Speech, which to be fair I never saw as much of a loss, and Blade, Blunt and Hand-to-Hand were merged into one-handed and two-handed, with Hand-to-Hand effectively being cut, aside from a handful of perks and racial abilities. In terms of magical skills, the Mysticism school was removed entirely, and its spells were redistributed to other schools, for example Soul Trap moved to Conjuration. And finally, Oblivion's Armourer skill, which was used for repairing gear, was replaced in Skyrim by the infinitely superior and far more in-depth smithing skill that allowed you to forge and improve weapons and armour. And notably, Skyrim removed the need to repair gear entirely. Now, there's no doubt that these changes streamline gameplay. However, they also homogenize the experience. For example, your stealthy thief and burly warrior in Skyrim both run at the same base speed. Unlike in Oblivion, where the thief's high speed attribute and athletic skill might make them noticeably quicker, and that does matter when it comes to how we judge a game as an RPG specifically. Now, let's go beyond character sheets and leveling and consider how Oblivion and Skyrim's gameplay mechanics feel moment to moment, and let's start with combat and magic, as they're such huge parts of the RPG experience. Well, Oblivion's combat took what I consider to be a very positive step away from Morrowind's dice roll-based hit system and moved to an action-based combat system. Basically, you swing a sword and if it physically connects, you'll hit the enemy. No more miss messages because of low skill impacting your percentage chance to hit, thankfully. Oblivion also took this a step further and introduced different power attack directions that added an additional layer of depth to combat. For example, a backward power attack could paralyze an enemy at master skill level, and a sideways attack could knock an enemy down. However, despite this and some other improvements to the combat system, combat in Oblivion is still often described as floaty. Weapons don't really feel like they're connecting with any weight. It kind of feels like you're waving a pool noodle around, and it's pretty much the same feeling or lack of feeling when the enemies are hitting you back. I'm not going to say that Skyrim doesn't suffer with the same problem, as it absolutely does. However, the game did make improvements on its predecessor and refined the combat to feel more visceral. The physics and animations were improved, so a melee weapon hit did feel like you had some level of connection at least, and the addition of finishing moves did add some cinematic flair, though to be fair they do bug out half the time. Skyrim also made some nice additions like dual wielding, meaning that you could equip a weapon in each hand, something that you couldn't do in Oblivion where offhand always had to be a shield or nothing effectively. And archery, for example, is also widely regarded as superior in Skyrim. Arrows arc a bit more realistically, have some weight behind them, and they can stagger targets. And I'd also say that the slow motion zoom perk does make archery feel a bit more tactical. On the flip side, magic in Oblivion felt a lot more flexible. You could cast spells without having to unequip a two-handed weapon, for example, since casting was bound to a separate button and didn't require equipping a spell to one of your hands. This meant a warrior could always have a healing spell ready, for example. Skyrim changed this to a sort of hand-based casting system. If you want to cast, say, a fireball, then you need to equip that spell to either your left or right hand, unless it's a shout or power. This made dedicated mage builds more distinct, but ironically it made hybrid combat a bit less convenient. You could no longer swing a two-handed sword and then instantly cast a fireball. You'd have to sheathe the sword or access the quick menu to change things around. Speaking of magic, that brings us to a major point in favour of Oblivion's RPG depth, and that is spellcrafting. In Oblivion, once you gained access to the Arcane University or Frostcrag Spire, you could mix and match effects to create your own spells. You could do things like creating a custom fire spell that also drained the enemy's health, or you could stack multiple buffs into one uber spell to enhance your combat abilities. This system allowed for tremendous creativity and min-maxing, not just for mages, but for any character that you wanted to use magic with. You could create the exact spells that suited your playstyle. Unfortunately, Skyrim removed spellcrafting entirely, and every spell you cast in Skyrim is a pre-made spell that you either find or buy. This was likely to balance the game and make each spell feel more distinct, and perhaps due to technical reasons with Skyrim's dual casting system. And to be fair, Skyrim did add new layers to magic. I already mentioned dual casting, but then there's also the perk trees that supported each school of magic. So I don't think it's as simple an argument as Oblivion had spellcrafting, so it offers the superior RPG magic system. I think it's actually kind of a mixed bag. Oblivion's magic is deeper in customization, whereas Skyrim's magic is far more balanced and integrated into the combat system, making magic feel more of a primary combat style rather than an added extra. Another thing I want to talk about before we move on to the sort of more storytelling and world building aspects of these two RPGs is each game's take on crafting skills and the economy that supports them. I think it's fair to say that Skyrim expanded the crafting elements of the Elder Scrolls series significantly. Both games offered reasonably deep alchemy and enchanting skills, at least for their era, which did have a significant impact on your character's power in both games. However, Skyrim also introduced a full smithing profession, in which you can mine ore, smelt it into ingots, and craft your own weapons and armor from scratch. This perfectly fits the RPG idea as playing as a blacksmith or as a self-sufficient adventurer, and it just adds another avenue for progression. It also heavily affects gameplay balance, as you can smith extremely powerful gear in Skyrim, especially once you add enchanting into the mix as well. Oblivion, on the other hand, didn't allow you to forge new weapons or armor, which is definitely a limitation from a role-playing perspective, and quite frankly, a surprising omission. However, what neither game did particularly well was to create a decent economy for these professions to integrate with. In both Skyrim and Oblivion, it's way too easy to get obscenely rich using alchemy, enchanting, and smithing in the case of Skyrim, and money does become somewhat trivial unless you plan to buy and upgrade every single player house in the game. Everything else will be easily affordable. This doesn't really serve either game from an RPG perspective, as the trivialization of an economy removes a number of roleplay opportunities that essentially play off of scarcity in an economy, which, if cleverly exploited, can lead to meaningful benefits. Now, of course, a good RPG isn't all about stats and systems. It's about storytelling, it's about world building, and the impact of player choices on that world. Now, the Elder Scrolls series isn't exactly famed for BioWare-style branching narratives, but there are definitely some key differences worth exploring between Oblivion and Skyrim in this area. If you're coming from a choice-heavy RPG like Fallout or The Witcher, both Oblivion and Skyrim might feel a bit light on dialogue options. Neither game gives you a complex web of conversation choices that will influence the outcome. Often it's just a case of saying yes or no to a quest. But that being said, Oblivion had a few more RPG-inspired dialogue mechanics than Skyrim did. For starters, it featured a persuasion minigame where you'd attempt to admire, joke with, coerce, or boast to an NPC in order to raise your disposition with them. It was basically a little puzzle that you could play to butter people up. It was overly simplistic, and once you figured it out, it quickly went from being an interesting feature to something of a boring chore, but at least it was an attempt to make your speechcraft skill and personality attribute actually matter in conversations. Whereas in Skyrim, character disposition numbers are hidden from you, and there's no persuasion minigame. Instead, speech will occasionally unlock some persuade or intimidate dialogue options for specific responses. For example, you might convince a guard to overlook a crime or persuade a merchant to give you better prices. However, it's pretty inconsistent and it can't be relied upon, and therefore the feature feels somewhat outside of the player's control, meaning that you can't really build your character around it from a roleplay perspective. For example, you couldn't really play as a silver-tongued rogue who can talk their way out of anything. The tools just aren't there. And again, this just removes another layer of roleplay opportunity. To be fair, in both games, the vast majority of conversations just involve getting information with no real regard for your character, but at least in Oblivion they hadn't quite given up on pretending otherwise yet. Both games do mostly funnel you along the same main quests and guild quests, pretty much regardless of what you say. You typically have two choices, to be helpful or to not engage at all. You can usually accept or decline a quest, but if you decline, that quest typically sits there until you come back to it and accept it later. There's no real consequence to not engaging, at least in most scenarios. The problem with this is it removes any feeling of player impact on the world, and you're left feeling that you're just an actor in someone else's story. You don't really have any real involvement in deciding the fate of the world through nuanced choices, but rather deciding what order to do things in and which content your character's going to either engage in or ignore. Another thing that Oblivion offered that was later removed in Skyrim was the fame and infamy system that basically takes into account your heroic and villainous deeds and then influences the way in which NPCs respond to you based on your overall score. For example, if you save a city, you might gain some fame, but if you murder a citizen, you're certainly going to gain some infamy. This doesn't drastically alter the game, but guards and NPCs will comment on your reputation. A famous hero will receive adulation, while the notorious thief or assassin might get snide remarks or fearful reactions. If your infamy is high enough, you may even be locked out of certain actions until you reduce it. For example, the righteous followers of the Nine Divines might refuse to serve you until you redeem yourself. And this creates a light sense of moral consequences. You can't be a holy crusader and a famous murderer at the same time, which is actually pretty ironic if you think about it, but there you go. In fact, the Knights of the Nine DLC questline even forces you to repent for your crimes if you wish to continue. Skyrim, on the other hand, chose not to include any infamy mechanic at all. The closest thing you get to morality in Skyrim is really how guards or NPCs react if they literally witness you doing something bad. And all they'll do is try to arrest or attack you like they would in any other Elder Scrolls game. And then, once your bounty's paid, you're basically forgiven and people will treat you completely normally again. So basically the game doesn't really do anything much to remember your deeds outside of a few scripted lines. However, Skyrim does present one major moral/political choice that Oblivion does not, and that's the Civil War. Siding with the Stormcloaks or the Imperials is a significant fork in the road for that questline, and it does have some impact on the world, for example who governs certain cities after the war. This is probably the biggest role-playing choice that Skyrim offers from a story perspective. You can effectively decide the political future of the province. Though I will add that it's not a particularly nuanced choice, it's pretty much a binary decision, and the quest outcomes are again pretty much mirrored. But it's fair to say that it certainly offers role-playing options due to the fact that you can adopt the identity of a patriotic Nord rebel, a loyal Imperial citizen, or you can just choose to not get involved at all. It's adding some RPG flavour in that regard. Beyond explicit story-altering choices, of which we've identified there are very few in the game, the design of individual quests do to an extent offer the opportunity to play a more nuanced role. This is particularly true in the case of Oblivion, and Oblivion's quests are often remembered for their creativity and the way in which they pull you into a scenario. The game arguably features a higher proportion of unique quests with interesting plot lines and choices, rather than sending you to clear random dungeons halfway across the map, maybe retrieving an item if you're lucky. Quests like Whodunit, the Dark Brotherhood quest where you attend a house party and systematically assassinate guests in creative ways, or A Brush with Death where you enter a magical painted world, stand out as memorable role-playing scenarios. They aren't branching in terms of story, but they require you to approach them with a bit of imagination, and they offer you multiple ways to solve the problem, especially with the Whodunit quest I mentioned, where for example you could talk to your targets and persuade them into splitting up so you could take them out individually, or you could set traps. Skyrim does have some standout quests too in this regard, such as the Mind of Madness, where you traverse the mind of a mad king with Shea Goraf's commentary in the background. Or another one could be A Night to Remember, a hangover-inspired drunken escapade. But many of Skyrim's quests do boil down to go to a dungeon, clear the dungeon, retrieve the item, rinse and repeat. And in that way, I think it definitely lost some of the handcrafted feel of Oblivion's one-off stories. Some of you might argue that this is a bit of an exaggerated take, and there probably is some truth in that. Like I said, Skyrim does have unique quests, and the guilds in particular do have their moments, but I always get the overall feeling that Skyrim's content wasn't as deeply written from a role-playing perspective as Oblivion's. The vast majority of Skyrim's quests don't offer alternative outcomes or clever solutions. You typically brute force your way through your problems, whereas Oblivion occasionally does let you talk or sneak your way through situations. For example, in Thieves Guild quests, you're very much encouraged to complete objectives without killing anyone, sticking to the sort of thief's code and ethos. Whereas Skyrim doesn't usually mind if you go in sword swinging for the vast majority of objectives. The game rarely acknowledges your method, whereas Oblivion sometimes gave bonus rewards for staying in character. For example, the Dark Brotherhood in Oblivion famously gave bonus rewards if you killed targets using specific methods, such as making it look like an accident, for example. And frankly, I thought that was just an awesome way to encourage and reward you for role-playing as an assassin. Skyrim's Dark Brotherhood does have a couple of optional objectives, like killing Astrid using a particular method, but these options are fewer than those offered by the game's predecessor. Of course, the magic of an RPG isn't just tied to the game's various storylines and how you're able to influence them through your actions and decisions. It's also about the sense of role-playing immersion that the game offers through how you interact with the world itself and its everyday inhabitants. Both Oblivion and Skyrim feature expansive living worlds with NPC routines and massive open environments in which you can go anywhere and do anything at any time. Oblivion's world was groundbreaking in 2006. It was pretty much unheard of for NPCs to have these routines where they ate, slept, and just generally went about their lives. Albeit sometimes quite comically, with infamous repetitive dialogue exchanges about mud crabs, for example. Skyrim refined this system further, with NPCs having more context-aware behaviours. Miners actually mine, and millers saw wood, for example. And the NPCs tend to react more to their environment as well as each other. For example, bandits might get into a brawl in a tavern, and children will play tag in the streets. From a role-playing perspective, I think it's fair to say that Skyrim's world does feel a bit more alive and reactive, at least on the surface. For example, NPCs will react to actions from the player such as whipping out your weapon inside a town. That's not a euphemism. Whereas Oblivion's NPCs feel a bit more static in their interactions outside of specific quests. This is strange because it is somewhat at odds with the fact that, in reality, Oblivion's NPCs are the ones who are actually taking account of your actions through the fame system. Skyrim's NPCs outwardly appear to be more impacted by the player actions in terms of their own reactions, but in reality there's no meaningful system that underpins those reactions and influences their perception of you outside of that particular moment. This is especially apparent with how NPCs react to the world-altering events of the main storylines. Oblivion wins out again in terms of giving you a feeling that the world is actually responding to your deeds. If you complete the main quest, the Oblivion gates will be closed forever, and you earn the title Champion of Cyrodiil, and people actually recognise that title. Similarly, if you complete the arena, which is more of a side activity in Oblivion, then you get the title of Grand Champion, and you'll even have an adoring fan who literally follows you around, as annoying as he is. What I'm saying is that the game responds to these events in a way that makes them feel significant, whereas in Skyrim, if you, say, complete the main quest and defeat Alduin, then the reaction from the world's inhabitants is somewhat muted. You get the occasional recognition for your deeds, but it mostly feels as if no one really noticed and nothing really changed. And while that's not game breaking, from an RPG perspective, it is all of these little details that aid in that sense of immersion in the game world because they reinforce your character's identity within that world. And in my view, Oblivion is the clear winner in this category. Skyrim does, however, outshine Oblivion when it comes to some of the smaller additional features that help to bring the world to life. One thing Skyrim introduced to enhance role-playing in the world setting, for example, was the different features that surround home life. You can marry an NPC, adopt a child, and you can even build and customize a house based on your particular taste and requirements. Oblivion did have purchasable houses in each city, but they were less customizable and they didn't offer any family life options as you find in Skyrim, unless you count that servant that you get with one of the more expensive homes. I can't quite remember the name of it. Now, of course, marrying and having an in-game family in Skyrim doesn't affect the overall narrative, but it does provide an additional layer to that sense of having a role and identity in the game world, which is what an RPG should be about. In summary, when it comes to storytelling and world building, both games offer a similar overall experience. Both Skyrim and Oblivion keep the player on a relatively railroaded story path with very limited branching, which is a pretty common critique of the Elder Scrolls series, to be honest. However, Oblivion does provide a few more explicit role-play mechanics such as disposition in the fame system, as well as more interesting and diverse side quests with greater opportunity for creativity in how objectives are completed, and also on top of that it gives you a greater sense of recognition for your deeds within that game world. Skyrim's game world does offer some roleplay and immersion factors of its own, such as the Civil War choice that we spoke about and the lifestyle options like marriage and adoption, but I think Oblivion is the clear winner in this category when it comes to comparing the games purely as RPGs. Anyway, after this long journey comparing Oblivion and Skyrim, where do we stand? Which game offers the superior RPG experience? Well, I think it's fair to say that Skyrim does have a lot to offer from a role-playing perspective, especially when it comes to making the genre itself more accessible to the mainstream audience. Its open-ended character progression, streamlined mechanics, and world interactivity make it an incredibly inviting game that millions have fallen in love with. The freedom it offers, both in exploration and character development, allows players to define their own journey, making it a highly effective role-playing sandbox. However, when it comes to the depth and structure of the role-playing mechanics, Oblivion, in my view, pulls ahead. Its character creation system forces meaningful decisions right from the start, ensuring that every build has weight and consequence. The game's skill system, while flawed in some ways, reinforces the idea of committing to a role rather than endlessly adapting as you see in Skyrim. Oblivion's quests are also far more creative and varied than those that you find in Skyrim, and also its fame and infamy system, unique guild progression, and the way that the world acknowledges your actions all contribute to a more reactive RPG experience, one where your character's identity and deeds actually matter. Skyrim undoubtedly improves on combat, crafting, and general quality of life features, and its world does actually feel more alive on the surface. However, I'd argue that much of this immersion is actually quite shallow. NPCs may react to your presence in the moment, but they don't often remember who you are in any meaningful way. And the removal of mechanics like spellcrafting, class-based progression, and moral consequence systems does come at a price. It strips away some of the depth that makes an RPG feel like a true role-playing experience. Ultimately, while Skyrim is the more polished and accessible adventure, Oblivion, I have to say, is the deeper RPG. It asks you to define your character early, live within the strengths and limitations of those choices, and then it engages you in a world that acknowledges your journey more meaningfully. Anyway, you've heard my view on the topic. More importantly, I'd like to hear yours, so let me know in the comments down below. And if you want even more RPG-based discussions and video essay style content much like this, then maybe consider joining my Patreon, where I'll be putting out new content every single week. Or if you don't like the idea of Patreon, then I'll also be making the videos available to YouTube members right here. Either way, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.